I want to welcome everyone for coming this afternoon. My name is Veronica Johnson, and I am a meteorologist for the NBC station here in town, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon's briefing. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our sponsors. The American Geosciences Institute, AGU, the American Geophysical Union, the AMS, American Meteorological Society, the Congressional Hazards Caucus Alliance, and of course, UCAR, University for Center of Atmospheric Research. All right. Well, here in this area, in D.C., of course, we're here today to hear about tornadoes, their destruction, what's working in saving lives, and what can we do better. So we wanted to present this to you from a couple of different angles. You're going to hear from someone on the research side today, Dr. David Strensrud, National Severe Storms Laboratory. You're going to hear from someone on the emergency management side today, Mr. Keith Stammer, Joplin County, Missouri. You'll hear from someone on the social science side, Ms. Julie DeMuth, social scientist for National Center for Atmospheric Research. And of course, you're going to hear from me, the communicator who is on television when tornadoes actually roll through. So here in Washington, D.C., of course, we do not get a lot of tornadoes that come through for the D.C., the Maryland, and Virginia area like a lot of states in the plains do. We average somewhere around 10 tornadoes per year that actually touch down versus the 30 to 50 per state for those areas in the plains. And of course, when it comes to tornadoes, possibility of tornadoes, to tornado warnings, there are a whole lot more warnings that are issued than, of course, the actual touchdowns. So let me begin then by taking you back to March the 2nd. The devastating outbreak, of course, that you heard of that came through so many states, Indiana, Illinois, and Kentucky. And let me also tell you then how we cover tornadoes here in the DMV. This, of course, was Henryville, Indiana. One of the things that was so hard for the folks that were faced there at schools with the school systems, the superintendents, the principals, is where to take the kids. Do we leave them at school and hope that that's a safe place, or do we put them on the bus and hope that they get home? Well, after this event, to my knowledge, there were no reports that there were any kids that had been injured from being on the school bus during when these storms came through. But of course, we know from the images that came out after the Henryville tornado and for so many states on that day that there were quite a few schools that were flattened. But such a hard decision, and wouldn't it be a decision maybe that could be a little easier with more research? There were 139 tornadoes that touched down in 11 states that day. And even here, even though the tornadoes weren't taking place here, we were still covering it on the air in Washington, D.C. Not just me, but a lot of the meteorologists. So one of the things that we do when tornadoes come through our area is we get on the air as fast as possible. Just get on the air and know that there will be people feeding us information. When we're on the air, of course, during a tornado event, we're going to stay on radar. That's the tool. That's what people want to see. Where's the storm now? Where is it headed? So we use radar information, we use it heavily, and that's our one weapon to get us through the whole event. We tell the public when we're on the air, of course, where the storms are, where they're headed. We advise the public what to do. And, of course, we make sure that we have closed captioning rolling during that time as well. Our news assignment desk. Everybody knows what a news assignment desk is, right? Yeah? Just nod. Yeah? No? Okay. Our news assignment desk, it's basically where all the scanners and radios are. It's our information hub, if you will. So we're able to listen to emergency management, we're able to listen to police, we're able to hear all the scanners and everything that's going on in the DMV. So we coordinate heavily with our assignment desk. They're feeding us information of any reports that they hear to the weather team. And even though maybe there was one person that jumped on the air, myself, there will be other people in our weather team to jump in and be part of that event as it unfolds. We stay updated with NOAA Storm Prediction Center, National Weather Service reports. Everybody knows what National Weather Service is, and you'll hear more about NOAA Storm Prediction Center in just a couple of minutes. We take calls from emergency management and eyewitness storm spotters as to what they're seeing and hearing. Those are the folks that are out there. We're inside of a weather center. We're confined. So we have to rely on everything that folks are hearing and seeing to feed back to us to turn it back around and tell the public what's going on. And that means then that we bring in the role of social media, which has been an enormous tool for us in the broadcast community. So throughout a severe weather event, we tweet and we Facebook continuously. So we're on the air. We may not be able to do it physically, actually, with our phones or sitting in front of a computer, but you can bet that we're telling somebody else right beside us, what do you want me to tweet? What do you want me to say? Where are the storms? What is it doing? We make sure that whatever message we're putting out there, whether it's on the air or through Twitter and Facebook, is clear, it's concise, and it conveys the seriousness of the event. We provide action items as to what to do, where to go for safety, because it wouldn't be any good if we just said, here's where the storms are. We've got to tell the people again, what kind of event is this? Events come in different shapes and sizes. We found, though, that our social media traffic goes up about 3 times higher during a high-impact event, with tornadoes, with hurricanes. Our Facebook likes increased by 6%. We average about 1.9% on just an average day or average week. Our Twitter followers up 12%. We normally average about 2.5%. So that's the power of Twitter and Facebook. Us as meteorologists, broadcast meteorologists, not just putting out that information, but getting information back from our viewers, from people who are out there. Radar isn't going to pick up everything. So it really is a wonderful tool to have, and it's a tool that complements what's already out there. Broadcast radio, cable, NOAA weather radio, reverse 911, and of course sirens. The other thing that we found during events like tornadoes is that we'll create an action page. I know I see a lot of young faces out there. You guys are pretty familiar with Facebook. You know, you can create Facebook tabs for specific things, and that's exactly what we do during high-impact events. We'll create a Facebook tab page that's separate that'll have these action items on it. The other thing like Twitter and Facebook is when we can't get there, if we can't send a crew somewhere and we can't be everywhere, is the power of the people who are part of our community. Getting photos, getting video back into us that we're not just putting out on the air, but we're providing online. So folks can actually take their own video on their phones or however, send it to us, and then it goes on our page. So all of a sudden now, we have much more in the way of video and photos, painting a better picture of what's actually taking place. Here's a breakdown for you of not just for this area, but for the entire country, the fatalities by location when it comes to tornadoes. 44.2% from mobile homes. How many of you in here knew that it was that high? I see a couple of heads nodding, right. Enormous. So part of what you're going to hear today from some of the other people that are speaking is, what can we do to have better research so that that number is lower? Research for better warnings, better communication. The annual impact of tornadoes, well over $1 billion. The average fatalities per year, 63.3 if you want to break it down, but 63. Make sure you remember that number for the next slide that's coming up. Total injuries, 999. So far this year, this is the kind of year it's been so far. And we'll probably be seeing more of these types of years. So we're off to a heck of a spring severe weather season already with 55 dead. And it's likely to get worse instead of getting better. So many of the products that I use to deliver a better forecast come from NOAA. You're going to hear now from Dr. David Strensrud, who's Chief Forecast Research and Development Division at NOAA's National Severe Storms Lab. David.
So I've been asked to talk about, in essence, the future of severe weather warnings. And I thought to start, we actually should look at what we're doing presently. So the National Weather Service actually provides information out to 7 days in the form of outlooks for severe weather with categorical, basically slight risk, moderate risk, and high risk. And of course, to highlight the areas. And you can see this is actually for the March 2nd event, and you can see that, let's see if I can do this right. Yeah, so they had a slight risk, grew to a moderate 2 days before. The day of the event, they actually went to a high risk. And then, of course, as that day evolves, when conditions ripen for severe weather to start, the Storm Prediction Center issues a tornado watch, which is in a much smaller, better defined area. And then as storms actually form, as they become severe, then the local office of the Weather Service issues then warnings, so tornado warnings or severe weather warnings. So I guess a question might be, how well are we doing? So if you see in red here, we have basically, this is tornado warning lead time. So lead time is the time difference between when a warning is issued and when actually the tornado is seen to touch down on the ground. And if you go back 25 years, the average lead time was 3 minutes. 3 minutes is not very long to take any kind of action. You better know exactly what you're doing. And yet in 2011, the average was up to 15 minutes. So a 5-fold increase in 25 years. I think you could view that as a success story for the whole watch warning system. But of course, we still have fatalities. We still need to do better. And so the question then becomes, how do we improve what we're already doing? And I think there are 3 ways you could look at this. One is better observations of what storms are doing. We still don't know how tornadoes form in many respects in terms of our physical understanding, and so that needs to be improved. And I think in the future we can look at this improved use of computer models actually in the warning process, something that we call warn on forecast. So for improved observations right now, we're actually undergoing in the Weather Service an upgrade to the current Doppler weather radars, and it's called dual-polarization. Now I'm not going to explain what it does, but think of it as a Doppler radar on steroids because it provides more information about what's going on inside the storm. And so this map here on the lower left basically shows you the current network of radars. The ones that are in green, the dark ones, are basically where they've already upgraded to this dual polarization. The ones in the red are currently undergoing upgrade, and the rest will be done by the end of 2013. So you might think, well, how does this affect tornadoes? Well, we also rely on spotters, because spotters tell us, does this storm have a tornado or not? Because some storms, they look from radar that they should have one and they just don't. And if you're at night, you either have to have a very lucky lightning strike nearby to see it. If you're in a very heavily forested area, it's hard to see, or if there's fog. And so you can't always tell if there's a tornado on the ground. But dual polarization actually has this ability to detect tornadoes. And this is actually an example from the Huntsville radar from the March 2nd event. And so we have reflectivity on top. Reflectivity tells us basically how much rain or hail is actually in the storm. And it has signatures, so it has a characteristic look to it. And this storm actually has what we call a hook echo. And also, the current Doppler radars have information on is the rain moving towards you or away from you if you're at the radar site. And so if you have basically this co-location of a red and a green, that's indicating towards and away, and you're actually seeing rotation, which is an indication of a severe storm. But then you add in dual pole, and you get this signature basically of debris being lofted. So whether that's branches or boards or shingles, it shows up. So when you add these two together, the forecaster knows there's actually a tornado on the ground. And that's an important piece of information that they can use then, I think, to extend warning lead times even more into the future. Because if they know there's storms prolific, producing a tornado, the next time a storm forms on that day, they're going to be even faster to issue a warning than they would be otherwise. So that's a good thing. But I think in the future, we're actually looking at something called phased array radar. It's been used in the military for decades. What we have are these big dishes that turn around and around, and they slowly tilt up. So if you're actually looking at one spot, it takes 4 minutes basically before you get back and look at that spot again. 4 minutes seems like a pretty short time period, but for a severe thunderstorm or a tornado, 4 minutes is a long time. So if you think of a football game, the current radar is like basically watching one play for every set of downs. You still see the game, you still see the back and forth, but you miss a lot of the continuity, a lot of the detail. Phased array, it's like seeing every single play in the football game. If this works, the bottom is the current Weather Service radar, and the top one is phased array. And look on the bottom, it's sort of jumping. That's sort of the way we see it. The storms do a lot of movement. On the top is phased array. It's a very smooth, continuous. We see structures, we see them repeated. It develops confidence that this is actually going to happen. And so I think it'll also lead to improved warning lead time. They'll be more confident to issue a warning faster with phased array. It really is an exciting technology that perhaps we could get out the next decade or so. So the other part is improved understanding. So tornadoes are still a bit of a mystery of why they form. And unfortunately, we can't put them in a test tube and study them nicely. We have to actually go to where the tornadoes are. And so there is a joint National Science Foundation and NOAA project in 2009 and 2010 called Vortex 2, which basically, with mobile radar systems, with what we call mobile mesonettes, with mobile vans that launch weather balloons, with deployable instrumentation that you would lay out on a line across a mile or two and then have the storm pass over it, and you'd come back and you'd collect the data with video and photogrammetry. We actually moved across, in essence, the plain states of the U.S. to try to be in the right place at the right time. So you have to imagine how hard this is. It's kind of like a big ballet where you have to know where to put the instrumentation to begin with because the storms move at 30 or 40 or 50 miles an hour, and you have to deploy them and keep people safe at the same time around the same storm, which is a very complicated thing to do. So this is just an example of we can get a radar. I think this radar was probably within about 6 or so miles of the storm. It's sampling then in the small sector basically every 45 seconds or so. You see a lot of structure that we don't see on the operational Weather Service radars because of the proximity to the storm and the fast updates. And of course, we had people out then that were putting basically instruments in the field, the storm would cross over them. And now, of course, the challenge is then integrating all this data and making sense of it from the physical perspective to understand what goes on then to produce tornadoes. And so Vortex 2, here's all the instruments. We had the radars in the back. We have all the people involved here in the front. Just a huge collection. They will overwhelm local hotels as they're going out and doing this. Observed 30 severe thunderstorms with almost all the instruments. That's, I think, incredibly impressive. And I think it has actually data with unprecedented quantity and quality. And of those 30 thunderstorms, 10 had tornadoes. And so here's our chance now to dig in to the data. But unfortunately, of course, that takes a lot of time and effort. It's not easy. But we're already seeing some early results from some of the Vortex scientists that actually is leading us to understand better how tornadoes form. And hopefully that then will lead to improved warnings. And then the future, what I call the future, is what we call warn-on forecast. Because right now we warn when we see a signature is on our radar that suggests a tornado is on, we warn on it. We'd actually like, in essence, to be able to predict when they're going to form, say up to an hour in advance. And to that, we have to use a computer model. So the idea is that you have a developing, let's call it a garden variety thunderstorm. It's not severe, it's just kind of getting going, maybe it's starting to rain. But we integrate that data with satellite, with surface observations, with everything that we have, we put it into a model, and we make a forecast out to an hour. And from that forecast, we can then get, say, a likelihood of tornado on the ground at some future point in time. And we can then make these, this is just a simple schematic here. And then, of course, if we do this right and everything comes together, say half an hour later, these garden variety thunderstorms have blossomed into what we call a tornadic supercell, and it's moving down the area where 30 minutes before we had predicted it would be, and maybe there's a tornado on the ground. So you might think, well, that's a good little conceptual model, but actually, can we do this? So we went back for the Greensburg, Kansas tornado, another devastating event. We put together all the radar data from that event, and then we made a forecast. So it's kind of a hindcast, I guess you could call it. And we divide it into 4 15-minute intervals. So a 0 to 15-minute forecast, 15 to 30, 30 to 45, and 45 to 60. And the yellow here is the actual observed damage path of that tornado. And the star here is Greensburg. And so this kind of blobby area in red and blue are the likelihoods then that the model is saying that there would be something like a tornado on the ground. And so you can see that we're tracking pretty much down the actual tornado path, and that actually for Greensburg, this could have potentially given maybe 45 minutes of warning lead time, which is a lot. And also provides confidence information from these probabilities. But perhaps most important is the red here is a typical Weather Service warning area for a tornado. It's a pretty broad area, and because it has to be based on current technology. But if this works as well as we hope it will, we can really reduce the area where we actually have to warn for a tornado with some certainty. We reduce the number of false alarms then, the number of times people are warned and nothing happens at their house. And of course, we would like to be able to update this, say, every 5 minutes so they would get repeated information, which could be helpful. Now, you could say, well, that was one case. You got lucky. Well, here's another case, Oklahoma City. Again, the tornado path is in the yellow. And once again, we have these probabilities from the model that actually tracks down the observed tornado path. And again, is a much smaller area that we would have to warn on than the current Weather Service tornado warning polygons. So our part of this is basically we want to provide high quality weather warning information to allow people to make the best decisions then for themselves, for their families, and for their businesses.
So imagine that devastating tornadoes have come through your town. Homes are flattened, businesses are flattened, and there's just enormous piles of debris everywhere, and people are walking around confused, maybe even some of your own family members that are unaccounted for. So how do you sort through all that? Who do you call? Well, you call the likes of Keith Stammer. Keith is Director of Emergency Management Division out of Joplin, Jasper County, Missouri. Let's welcome Keith.
First of all, allow me to echo Scott's comments earlier regarding Congressman Long. My standing joke is that for the first 2 weeks, I accused him of having a cot in my emergency operations center because it seemed like every time I turned around, he was standing there. He was of great help to us, and we really do appreciate it. I want to tell you a little bit in two different areas. One, to tell you the story briefly of what happened to us, and then secondly, what we have learned from that and what we're trying to do differently in the future. Just very quickly, Joplin, Missouri is a town that sleeps approximately 50,000 people at night. In the daytime, population swells to almost 250,000 people. We have people from 4 states that come in for shopping, employment, medical, and that type of thing. The thing that this did for us was this tornado struck on Sunday evening, 5:41 p.m., and not on Monday evening at 5:41 p.m. during the height of rush hour. This map to me is most telling about what happened in Joplin. This is an outline of the damage of the tornado. Our first responders referred to this map as the fish because of its shape. As you can see on the west, which will be the left side, two storms came together. This formed into what we call an EF0, winds in excess of 200 miles an hour tornado. It spooled up very quickly, began to widen as it spooled up, and it moved slowly. Most of these tornadoes, as David said, run, 35 miles an hour plus or minus. This one evidently slowed down in some points to 20 miles an hour. It moved across the city from west to east, some 6 miles by a mile wide. On the east side of the city, it began to finally dissipate. It made a right-hand turn and then moved down toward Diamond, Missouri into Newton County. Overall track was about 22 miles. It was on the ground for approximately 13.8. The major point of the destruction was in this path here of the city, which basically went border to border of the city. If you look at all the dots that are inside, you'll see a red-orange stripe down the middle. That is known as the expedited debris removal area. This map was provided to us by FEMA. They used satellite imagery to tell us which buildings were totally destroyed, which ones were majorly destroyed and would have to be knocked down. This was the basis for making the decision to go with the 90-10 split on a cost-share basis. The Fed said that FEMA said, yes, you can do that, but the date has been set for August 7th. This happened on May 22nd. We had 3 million cubic yards of debris, half of which was in this expedited debris area. Thanks to the efforts of our good volunteers and many of the people that helped, we were able to accomplish that cleanup effort by August the 6th. Some rather iconic photographs. Of course, we had quite a few fires in the area. The thing is in my business, we refer to this kind of a tornado as a smoother. It actually smooths the houses right off the foundations. When you went out there and looked, you could see the footings. Inside the footings, if there was an air conditioning unit, it was still there. Anything above the footings was ripped off and piled up to as high as 10 foot high on the debris, which meant that it ripped off the electrical, it ripped off the water, it ripped off the natural gas, and we lost water supply to approximately half of the city. 1/3 of the city itself was affected. This came through a residential area that was approximately 75 years old, some of our heritage from the mining days of lead and zinc. We had houses there that some of which didn't even have foundations, some of which had been built to current standards. It was quite a mix that was there. One of the things that our public works people did was immediately jump on the roads and get them cleaned up. Within 36 hours, we had 96% of the roads all cleaned off in order to facilitate our emergency response. We had 5,000 rescuers from some 435 different response agencies come in. From an emergency operations center standpoint, we've trained a National Incident Management System in the Incident Command System. We set that up. All disasters are local. They start locally, they end locally. They may, in fact, rise to national prominence somewhere in between, as this one did, but we did not ever release control of the oversight and the supervision that we were doing. And we used these responders as they came in. We made 6 full-time searches through the entire area, compliments to our fire chief, Mr. Mitch Randalls. We used some 60 different dog teams to look for the live people. We found our last live person on Tuesday afternoon. We brought in a helicopter, and we flew over every tree and every rooftop. We brought in community emergency response team and had them do ground searches for us the entire 18-mile length. We brought in dive teams, and we dove every single body of water, every golf course hazard, every swimming pool, every settlement pond, every ditch. Anything that we found standing water, we looked through it. We also brought in other fire departments to bring their extrication tools. We lost approximately 7,000 vehicles during this time. Many of them were stacked up at the big lot stores, the big box stores on the east side of town, and began to just disassemble those cars as those we could not see in order to make sure that we did not miss anyone. When we went to do the debris removal some weeks later, we had spotter teams with each of the debris removal teams. Fortunately, we were correct, and we did find everybody during that several-day period. We had more than 1,000 people injured and 161 fatalities. We're not really sure about how many people were injured. We have 2 hospitals, St. John's of which was destroyed. You'll see that picture in a minute. Freeman Hospital remained. They reported to me that in the first 15 minutes they had 100 casualties. People come in. Within the first 60 minutes they had 600. Within the first 18 hours they had 1,700, and then it was done. So some of those are the normal things. We still have car wrecks, we still have heart attacks, we still have people with the flu, but maybe 1,000 to 1,200 people were injured during that time. As we say here, 161 fatalities as a direct result of that, which is quite remarkable to us with the number of people that were in that area, that it was actually so few people. This is St. John's Hospital, now known as Mercy Hospital since their reorganization January 1. By the way, that's a medical helicopter on its side, top towards you, in case you can't recognize that outline that's there. St. John's itself was destroyed in that the top 3 floors twisted about 4 inches to one side. So if you know anything about concrete and steel, it does a fine job for up and down, left and right, not so much. I participated in an evacuation drill with them approximately 5 years ago. We were quite pleased to see that they were able to evacuate 50 practice patients in a matter of 2 hours. On May 22nd, that evening, they had 180 patients plus staff in the building, and they totally evacuated that building in total in 90 minutes. Did a very fine job. We estimate some 7,500 structures were destroyed. If you count apartments, FEMA tends to count each individual apartment as a dwelling. That's almost 8,000 dwellings that were just totally damaged, destroyed, or to the point that we could not use them in any way, shape, or form. Joplin High School. The Joplin School Administration did an outstanding job. They had 10 schools that were damaged, 6 of which were destroyed, not the least of which is the Joplin High School. This and the Franklin Technical Center, just immediately to the west of that building, were both used in the determination by the National Weather Service to be able to decide wind speeds of approximately 205 miles an hour. Fortunately, graduation was happening that night, but in the past years it's been so large that they moved graduation to the Missouri Southern State University on the north side of town. So again, a rather propitious situation for us. There was no one in the school building at the time. We had in that area of 6 miles by 1 mile some 17,000 people that were affected by it. 9,200 of them were displaced. We lost 2 fire stations, 3 apparatus, 5 different parks, numerous facilities as far as public works is concerned, from a city infrastructure, street lights, street signs. It was very strange to go to a location that you thought you knew, and suddenly you realize you really weren't sure where you were because the gas station you always turned at just simply was not there. This is an example of the big box stores that were over on the east side along what is known as Range Line. A Home Depot here, we had 8 fatalities there. Home Depot and Lowe's did outstanding jobs. They've long been partners with FEMA. They showed up with trucks full of chainsaws, rakes, gloves, safety glasses, handing them out. Our citizens said, when do you want these back? They said, we didn't say that. You just need these. Here they are. You get in there and get after them. Home Depot immediately put up a 60,000 square foot tent, and now they have totally rebuilt back and are back in business. We had an outstanding animal rescue operation. May I say to you, if you own a pet, please spend the $25 or so and have your pet chipped. It was very nice for those to be able to run a wand over certain pets and know who they belong to. We have a MOU with the local Humane Society to handle our pets. They were immediately overwhelmed. The ASPCA came in, did an outstanding job. They had up to 2,000 rescued animals. They were able to rehome approximately 500 of them. After some time, several weeks, they held an adoption fair. We had 6,000 people from 50 states show up over a 2-day period to adopt those 1,500 animals. And of course, they did the right thing. They also used this as an opportunity to bring in animals from all over the area so that everybody who wanted one could go home with an animal. Spirit of cooperation and can-do attitude within the city. I can say, as the emergency management director involved in this from the get-go, I can honestly say that we did not have any one person or any one organization stand up and say, I'm in charge, you're not, shut up and get over it. It was a cooperative effort. I think it affected all of us to such an extent that we understood that we were overwhelmed. The state resources were overwhelmed. The federal was there, FEMA was there, which we've mightily appreciated, but we all had to find some way to work together in getting this done. The faith-based organizations, again, did an outstanding job. Based on the ice storms of 2007, the Mother's Day tornado of 2008 just south of us, various other wind events and weather events that we've had, we've worked long with our faith-based organizations. They oftentimes handle our volunteer coordination and also act as points of distribution. We have 4 megachurches in town with membership in excess of 1,000 members. They each set up as points of distribution. The Seventh-day Adventists, who specialize in warehousing, came in and set up a multi-agency warehouse, MAW, if you will, and everything was collected. At that point, the 4 churches then went in and picked up the diapers, Infamil, blankets, school supplies, took them back to their churches and did distribution not only to the people that came by, but also to additional 20 churches that acted as sub-points of distribution. Thanks to AmeriCorps, who immediately responded. We'd worked with them before. They were there the first thing on Monday morning. Bruce and company called us Sunday night and said, we're coming from St. Louis. We'll be there. When the sun came up, they were there. Not only did they jump in and help us do the sorting that we needed to do for picking up debris, they set up a volunteer management center, which helped us sort out those people that were able and willing to volunteer and those that were just sightseers. It helped us record the number of hours. To date, we have almost 120,000 separate volunteers that have registered since May 22, with a total of 727,000 plus volunteer hours that have been donated to the work there. Soon after this happened, the National Weather Service came through to do what they always do in terms of these large events, and that is an assessment. They talked to myself, city administration, county administration, and then they went out into the streets and talked to people who actually were victims. And they came away with an assessment, and there were 4 points on this assessment that we felt like in Joplin we had to pay a particular attention to. And they were, first of all, that many Joplin residents were desensitized by the fact that they perceived that we had turned on the sirens quite a bit. We test our sirens every Monday morning, except for the 2 months in the dead of winter. And they thought they turned them on all the time. It was just one more time. Why should I pay attention to them? Secondly was the need for NOAA weather radios. Warning sirens are outdoor warning sirens. They are made for those who are out of doors to be warned to go indoors. You can't hear them indoors. They're not designed for it. So weather radios need to be placed indoors. Thirdly, we need to change our approach to weather warnings and examine the kind of language that we use and processes that we use in warning people. Then finally, to look at the societal aspects, which you'll hear from in just a minute, as to getting inside people's heads and what they think about whenever they are warned. So, as a result, the first thing we did was immediately move our testing of our sirens from every Monday to the first and third Monday of each month. That cut us down to approximately 50% activation. The city is spending $200,000 out of its own pocket to upgrade the electronics on all of our sirens. This will give us two-way radio communication with our sirens and will enable us to do silent testing. So a good example would be if we have a storm come through at 2 o'clock in the morning, I can pull the sirens immediately, ask, are you okay? They'll send back and say, I've lost a battery or I'm fine. And when that happens, by the middle part of this summer, we will then go to siren testing the first Monday of every month, which is a 75% reduction in the number of tests that we do. Our saying after that point is going to be, if you hear the sirens go off, and it's not the first Monday of the month at 10 a.m., then you need to go hide. Secondly, the city has embarked upon a program to purchase a NOAA weather radio for every household within the city of Joplin. Does not have one. Last week alone, we handed out 4,000 of these pre-programmed NOAA radios. Thirdly, we are participating with the National Weather Service regarding our efforts to implement an impact-based warning system. And fourthly, we want to give more weight to the societal element in information processing, understanding that when someone hears the warning, they must hear it, understand it, believe it, personalize it, decide to act, and act appropriately. It's too easy on my side to just say, we've pushed all the buttons, we screamed into the radios, we warned television and radio and out there, and now it's your responsibility. And fortunately, with the social scientists, they have come along as a result of this National Weather Service assessment and have said we really need to get into the minds of the individuals. Some suggested websites. We have moved all of our websites that crop up for people looking for donations, looking for volunteer work, under rebuildjoplin.org. If you want to volunteer, go there. If you want to make a contribution, you go there. We list everything that we have needs-wise, names, addresses, and phone numbers of those that receive them. The City of Joplin has a website, joplinmo.org. And may I direct you, please, to joplinschools.org, and so that you can hear about that wonderful story that they did as well. And then, of course, everybody is on Facebook.
So we can improve our forecast. But we have to also improve how we communicate and how individuals interpret that weather information. Everybody is a little different. With the latest on where our weather community is in regards to societal relevance of weather products, Julie Demuth, who's scientist with the Societal Impacts Program at NCAR.
So it's my job to get into your heads, according to Keith. That's what I'm here to do today. And to start, I want to start by telling you a story. And this is a story about a woman named Marion. And she's a woman that I personally interviewed following a tornado outbreak. And Marion let me into her home. And I asked her to tell me her story, and this is what she said. She started by telling me that there was information all day long on the television and on the radio, so she was very well aware of the threat of the possibility of tornadoes. She told me that about 4 o'clock that afternoon, the first siren blew, and she knew it was a warning, but she said, I still wasn't totally concerned. I'm not sure why. I've lived here for a long time, and sometimes the warnings don't materialize, which is great. But then she said about 15 minutes later, the second siren went off. And she said, and then I took notice, and I decided that this is something serious. Her son-in-law, who lived next door, called her, and she said at that point he was concerned, and he suggested that she go over to his house, and at first she didn't, but she said, I guess I got to thinking about it more, and then I did go over. She said we were going to stay there in a closet, but then her son-in-law looked outside and saw the tornado coming, and he decided at that point and said, this is when we're going to go to the storm cellar, and she said, and that's what we did. Turned out she had her own in-ground storm cellar about 100, 200 feet away, and that's where they went to shelter. She also told me that she didn't consider doing that before because she said that it's an old storm cellar, and I myself could not have gotten into it because it's such a heavy door. It's a steel door. Marion is, I think at the time I interviewed her, she was in her early 80s, but she said, of course, her son-in-law could get in. She also told me, I've lived here for 36 years, that storm cellar was there when I moved in, and we've never had to use that before. So it's a really powerful story, this experience that Marion had, and I want to come back around to this, but I think it illustrates some of the things that I'll talk about here. So following both Dave and Keith, when there is a tornado event or any kind of severe weather event, there's a lot of amazing information, really good, accurate, timely information that comes out from Weather Service forecasters, broadcast meteorologists like Veronica and others, from the emergency management community and many other people. So all this information is created and disseminated, but what happens between that, when that information goes out and when people are impacted, is a really important area. It's kind of a gap. We don't often think about it that much, but that's what I want to talk about today. So when we think about risks, oftentimes we think about things like nuclear power plant meltdowns or terrorist attacks or airlines crashing, but weather really can be a risk. It can pose harm to a lot of people, especially in the case of a major tornado event, like a tornado. And I think when it comes to how we respond to these risks, it's fair to say that all of us, Keith, Dave, Veronica, society as a whole, we have these common goals that we want to save lives and we want to reduce harm. And there's a lot of steps that go into this, and one of the important ones is, of course, understanding the weather. We have to understand how the atmosphere works. But that alone is not enough. What we really need to do then is understand how do people and the weather intersect. When we think about this intersection of people and weather, I kind of have this boiled down, overly simplified model here. We realize that people have to receive that weather forecast and warning information. They have to interpret it, and then, of course, they have to respond to it. And I have an arrow that connects these ideas because it is a cycle. People go through this often more than once during an event. They're interconnected. And even though it looks really neat and clean on this slide, each of these three areas is actually quite complex. All right, so the first one, how people receive information. There's two aspects to this. Of course, it's what you use to get your information, what are your sources, what are your channels, and then what does that message look like? What is the content of that? From past work and past research, we know that people receive forecast and warning information from multiple sources. Number one, across the board, whether it's day-to-day weather or extreme weather events, is almost always local television. You're going to turn to Veronica. You're going to turn to your local broadcast meteorologist and get information. But another really important source is other people, right? We talk to each other. We get information from our family, our friends, our coworkers. And then we take our own observations. We look out the window. We step outside. We see if that tornado is coming, or we look to see what the sky looks like. So the fact that people get forecast and warning information from multiple sources kind of goes to this next point, that we seek confirmation of a threat. And we do this all the time. It doesn't matter if it's weather. If the smoke alarms went off right now, we would look around and we would see, is there smoke? Is there really a fire before we respond? We do this all the time as we're really trying to gauge and personalize our own risk. And so that's why this point here about having information that is repeated during a severe weather event, it's redundant. It's really critical to do that. It's also critical that information is consistent. Wherever you turn to, it should be the same, because otherwise people are confused and they need to figure out what to do. Keith talked quite a bit about sirens and the pros and cons that are associated with them. We really have this love-hate relationship with sirens in the community. One thing we know is that people like them. Especially if you come from a community where you're used to hearing sirens, you rely on them. It's not uncommon for people to say, I'm going to wait until I hear the sirens and then I'm really going to know what to do. I'll realize the situation is serious at that point. However, like Keith mentioned, they're meant to be outdoor warning system. That's what sirens are supposed to do. They're not meant to wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning. They're not meant for you to hear them when you have your television blaring or your radio blaring. And that's something that people don't necessarily always understand. And then, of course, new technology is changing the way so rapidly about what information we get and how we get it. All of us probably here in the room have cell phones, except for me, because my phone died the other day, which is very frustrating. But we have cell phones. We have smartphones. I have this picture of a weather bug. If you have a weather bug app, or there's so many other weather apps that you can get that will push information out to you, you'll get every watch and warning that comes out. And that's continually changing how we're getting information. But unfortunately, it's also raising some new issues and some new questions. And this is an anecdote I have. I am in school. I'm a grad student, and I'm set up to get any sort of warning messages. And so I got this a couple years ago. My campus was under a tornado warning, and I got this message that was texted to me about a tornado warning that was affecting the campus. I received this message at 2:30. Well, of course, being the weather geek that I am, I went and actually looked at the real warning. That warning was issued 26 minutes prior. It expired at the same time that I got it. So to what extent do people understand that there are these problems with technology, that there are delays in the system, whether it's bandwidth issues, whether it's the fact that this information has to be received by somebody and then retransmitted? This is raising a lot of new important questions. All right, so the second piece, how do people interpret information? Arguably, this might be the most complex, but also the most important part. And there's a lot of aspects to this, which I'll go through pretty quickly. First of all, how do people process and understand information? Now, this is an image that's a little bit hard to read. I apologize. But the Weather Service is considering, following the Joplin event, maybe having different levels of warnings, issuing different tiers of tornado warnings. And they're talking a little bit about what that language should look like. Should there be a significant tornado damage threat for a lower level threat? And then if it's more than that, it'll be catastrophic. Well, to what extent do people, what do they understand when they hear this kind of information? Do they interpret it the way the Weather Service wants them to? And of course, then what do they do with that? And these are important questions that will need to be researched. When it comes to interpreting information, we tend to have this bias that we think all we need to do is educate people, right? We'll give you the facts. We pour knowledge into your brain, and of course you'll then do the right thing out. It's that simple, right? Well, unfortunately, it's not, because people aren't machines. It's not like you have some input and we automatically, instantaneously process the information and it comes out perfectly the way we want every time. We know from a lot of research that this sort of model doesn't work. And there's a lot of reasons why it doesn't. First of all, experts themselves don't have perfect information. We know, of course, how imperfect weather forecast and warning information can be, despite the fact that we're getting better all the time. And then we as people, all of us, experts, lay people, we don't respond to risks, any kind of risks, much less weather risks, perfectly. We're not evaluating the cost and benefits. We're not like sort of doing the math in our mind and then deciding what makes the most sense. No, that's not how we do things. Rather, we interpret information very subjectively, based on our subjective and social filters. And there's a lot that goes into this. By subjective, I don't mean negative. This isn't a bad thing. It's just reality. And there's a lot of things that influence how people interpret information. Here are a couple of them that I think are really relevant in the weather context. First of all, our experiences. Weather is around us all the time, so we're constantly experiencing it. We're constantly building on that knowledge. And whether we've had recent experience, for example, if I had just lived through that Joplin tornado, that's probably going to influence how I interpret and respond to the very next tornado warning that comes through. Versus if I've never lived through a tornado, if I've never experienced a tornado warning, that's going to affect what I do. And whether your experiences are direct or vicarious. Do you experience them personally, or is it your family members? Is it your friends? Is it something that you see on television when you see all that damage and destruction? How does that all changes how people interpret information. And again, I mentioned before, we're not perfect. We have a lot of biases and a lot of shortcuts that we use. One in particular that comes from the risk literature is this notion of optimism bias, which says that we recognize that a risk exists, but we still think that our personal risk of experiencing some event is lower. So I might know that tornado's on the ground, and I might think that my neighbor will get hit, but I still don't think that I will. It's sort of this optimistic bias that we have. And of course, we know that emotion, we're learning this more and more, how much emotion plays into how we interpret things and what we do. So for example, if you have kids and there's a tornado warning and school is in session, what you do is going to be affected by your fear for your child's safety, by your worry, by all of those types of things. And then lastly, we're very social creatures, right? I have this idea of peer pressure, and I say that somewhat jokingly, but we act based on how those of us here in the room, whether they're complete strangers, what they're doing. If we're all sheltering from a tornado, that's going to influence how I interpret and how I respond. Okay, so this final area, how people respond. So now we've looked at how people receive information and how they interpret it. Even given all of that, how people respond is still dictated by a lot of things. It's influenced by their abilities, their physical ability. Can you open that storm cellar door? Your available resources. Do you even have an in-ground storm cellar, or is your best bet to go into the bathroom? And situation or context is so huge. Are we at home? Are we at work? Are we at school? Are we sitting in a congressional briefing where we don't know where the closest storm shelter is, or we might not know what the weather in this community is like? Those all affect how we respond. Okay, so knowing these things, let's revisit Marion's story. Marion wasn't a fatalist. She didn't completely ignore, or she wasn't somebody who felt like the Weather Service had no credibility. She was very attentive. We know she used multiple sources. We know she consulted with family members. We know she was physically limited, right? She couldn't get into that storm cellar door. And for better or for worse, we know she relied on her experiences. She talked about the fact that that tornadoes don't always materialize, and that she'd never ever use that storm cellar. And we know that she received and interpreted and responded to information multiple times. Now, Marion is just one case, but this is the kind of work that we do to start to understand what is it that people are thinking and what are they doing, and then how can we learn from that. So kind of bringing this all home, when we really have this goal of saving lives and reducing harm, it's important that we have good atmospheric science research and good forecasts. It's important that we have a really good, strong structure from the emergency management community. But we also need to fill in that gap of where humans and where weather meet, where they intersect. And there's a lot of work that's been done in the risk world, but frankly, a lot of it hasn't been done specifically in the weather context. We look at a lot of different things. And so this is an area where doing more work specifically looking at weather experiences is really important. And based on that, we can take what we learn and funnel it back into risk communication messages, or what forecast and warning messages should look like, or how they should be disseminated, or what policy changes, what kind of policies should schools have, or should government have for sheltering. This is all stuff that we can learn from. And this is a very young and emerging field, but I can tell you it's valuable, it's really exciting. I personally come from a background in meteorology, and now I'm also pursuing a degree in communication just so that I can try and bridge these worlds myself. There's a lot of people I know who are clamoring to do this kind of work. So I want to leave you with these final sort of suggestions. There's a lot of work that can be done in this area, But these are three that I particularly have highlighted that I think we can make a lot of great strides in. Again, this notion of what role do new technologies play in terms of how people respond or receive information. Experiences. How do people's experiences with weather influence how they interpret it? There are issues, people talk about overwarning and false alarms and desensitization. To what extent are those really problems? And then if we know that they are, what can we do about it? And then this last one is kind of big and broad, but I think it's important. We still don't know what is it that is the ultimate trigger that gets people to respond. And I think more work in this area is really important. And so, as we've talked about, we're just entering severe weather season. You're probably going to hear a lot of stories about tornadoes and people dying, and you yourself may have a lot of personal experiences. I just encourage you to think about these things and think about what we can do differently and do better.
We're just about ready to wrap up here in about a minute, but some of the takeaways that we wanted to make sure you had is that there's a lot of lessons learned from not just the Joplin, Missouri twister that came through, an event, but some of the other events that you heard here today. The partnership between meteorology and social science, it is a needed research partnership and one that provides better warning information for all of us. And of course, the ultimate goal is that we want to increase warning time and protect as many lives and property as possible. Thank you. My role in today's briefing was just moderating and making sure that as we brought together folks from different sectors in the research community, in the social science community, as well as in the emergency management community, those folks were actually on the ground talking about this partnership that we all have and what we all use, and that is weather information, timely weather information. And we know that the way to get that is by better research and proper funding and policy from the Hill to have what we need. Our ultimate goal here is to save lives and property. One thing that we know right now, our average lead time on tornadoes is around 15 minutes. With some of the research that's coming out in the next couple of years and what's being worked on right now, we know that we can better that lead time and, of course, save lives ultimately. The other thing that I really want to come out today, and that is that this is all about a partnership. I myself, I work on the air as a broadcaster, but in order for me to do my job, I've got to have the type of weather information from NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to be able to do my job well. And that means having better radar, that means having more timely information. I would say probably the most significant thing that at this point affects the most people will be what the emergency management people in Joplin, Missouri have done and how they're able to help other communities. We already were off to a phenomenal severe weather season with 55 people that have died already in 2012. We averaged somewhere around 63. We know right now that it's going to be an elevated severe weather season with many more tornadoes and, unfortunately, probably many more deaths. What the folks in Joplin, Missouri are doing, emergency management, is they're coordinating with other communities out there who have gone through the same thing so that they're not reinventing the wheel when it comes to bringing together all of these different sectors, from hospitals to police to folks who work with churches, and bringing everyone together after an event to be able to tackle what needs to be done. And that is getting to people, assessing the damage, and moving on as a community.
I talked about the future of severe weather warnings, so new observations, new understanding and improved understanding of how severe storms form, and also what the future warning system might look like. You know, when we work together, we can actually do even a better job at providing warning information to the public, which allows them to make decisions for themselves and their family to keep people safe. Probably what I learned most about was how complicated it is when people receive information and how they process it, and then come to a point where they have to decide whether to act or not, and how many factors influence every individual's decision. It's just astounding.
My portion of the presentation today was to talk about what happened right after May 22nd, the response and the recovery effort, and then secondly to talk about what needed to be done as a result of lessons learned. In terms of response and recovery and having your community set up for the next disaster, try and think beyond yourselves. One of the things that really struck us with regards to this particular tornado was it was much larger than anything that we had ever practiced before. So most of the time we think in terms of just the small things and what we're used to. I'd really encourage everyone to think in terms of something much bigger. David talked a lot about the upcoming technologies that are going to be out there, particularly phased array radar. I'm very excited about that. And I really appreciated what Julie had to say with regards to the social aspect of getting inside people's heads and trying to understand in their mind what happens in the thought process whenever they are warned.
So as part of this briefing on saving lives in the path of destructive tornadoes, I talked about the human component, how people intersect with the weather, and what we need to know about how they receive, interpret, and respond to information to save lives and reduce harm. So if there's one thing that I really want people to walk away with, it's the fact that we need to focus on the people. We need to understand how society is responding to disasters. But to be able to do that effectively, we have to work together in partnership. We have to work with the atmospheric science community, we have to work with the emergency management community, and we have to do the social science research as well, so that we basically hit all three components of that. I think the one thing I learned, and I know this actually all the time, is that the people who work in this community are very passionate. The atmospheric science researchers are passionate, the meteorologists are passionate, forecasters are passionate, emergency managers are passionate, and I think that passion is what's going to help us make great strides in saving people's lives.